Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Welcome to this week's installment of Romance and Modern Mythology. This week we are examining Avatar: The Last Airbender and Katara's fate. Now I had to take quite a few notes because this is really a very involved subject, and I have them off to this side, so if you see me looking off to the side, please forgive me. I'm just wanting to get through this as efficiently as possible because it is involved. So last week we examined Star Wars, and particularly the romance between Princess Leia and Han Solo. And at the end of it, I said, consider what would have occurred if Luke and Leia had not been made siblings, and what would have happened to the story, the arcs, the characters, if Luke had actually gotten the girl. So this week we're going to examine a Luke Skywalker-esque character that does actually get the girl in the end, and we're going to examine the consequences for the stories and why this is a little odd. So let's take a look at Katara's romantic prospects from her point of view, because most of the arguments I see, they're looking at it from Aang's point of view or one of the other possible suitors' point of view, but very seldom do we just try to put ourselves in Katara's shoes and see what's what. So that's what we're going to do today. Now then, let's discover why this is so controversial and has been a running argument since 2008 and will probably still be arguing with it 50 years from now. But to begin with, I want to explain something that I call the Goldilocks Formula. And another example of this pattern can be found in the novel Atlas Shrugged, in which the main character, Dagny Taggart, has three romantic options. Hank Reardon, Francesco d'Anconia, John Galt. And then there was a fourth character who was in love with her, but who was obviously never in the running, and we'll get into that in a moment. That was Atlas Shrugged, written by Ayn Rand. If you've never read it before, it's a long read, but it's a very good read, very psychological. So, the Goldilocks character. You will have one prospect that is too cold. He appears to be a suitable possibility for the heroine, due to his very good, outstanding moral qualities. He may actually be inspired by the heroine's actions, her bravery, her resolve. She sometimes serves as a catalyst for his later actions, but he isn't seen in the story as learning to take the initiative himself. So he still ends up being more passive than the heroine. Kind of a good soldier, but he's not really evolving into a leader. And because of that, he doesn't become the heroine's true equal and isn't a good long-term option. That brings us to number two, too hot. This would be a character that is of obvious and immediate romantic interest to the heroine, but there are usually tons of red flags. Not always, but more often than not, this is her favorite mistake. So picture the alpha male, leader of the pack, the undisputed ruler of his followers. Now sometimes, but again not always, this will be an amoral character or someone who has a deeply flawed or misapplied moral compass, more emotionally driven, and he can't provide the heroine with a sense of stability or security. So again, another unsuitable option for the long term. That brings us to number three, just right. Now, the just right option will be a character who possesses some of the qualities that are seen in his forerunners, both the too cold and the too hot, but he's the best of both worlds. He does tend to have that strong moral sense, even if there are mistakes in his past. This is probably someone who is a leader, but oftentimes not a flashy leader. And he has a good balance between his emotional and his intellectual impulses. This is a character who will be seen and treated by the heroine as an equal. Even on the occasions when they're at odds, we'll see more emotional intimacy between this pairing than we do between the heroine and other characters. And we'll consequently see a side of the heroine that is often shrouded from others, and they make an excellent team. And if they are a part of a larger group, they might become the de facto mother and father figures to the other characters within that group. And this option can also provide the heroine the stability and security that she craves and cannot get from other potential suitors. This is one of the things that very significantly will set this kind of option apart from the rest of the pack. This is also someone who probably shares power with the heroine rather than either party being solely in charge. Now this brings us to number four, which is the anomaly. Someone who is not quite like the others, and in many stories you see him hopelessly pining after the heroine, and you're wondering, why are you really here? This is a heroine, someone that she likes him, but doesn't see him in that way. She does not really regard him as an equal. This is where we are bringing in the Luke Skywalker type figure. Or to draw from Atlas Shrugged's cast, Eddie Willers. Eddie Willers was deeply in love with Dagny. He idolized her, but he was never really a contender for her hand. And likewise, if Luke Skywalker hadn't been Leia's twin brother, he would have been much the same. Probably still in love with her, idolizing her, but not really in the running to run off with her into the sunset. So we're going to see unrequited love. One-sided, feelings only going one way situation. Sometimes this character can actually be quite irresponsible, sort who would run away from obligations, recoil when things become difficult emotionally. He does not and cannot give the heroine a sense of security, and more likely he leans on her for support while not returning the favor. Now, not always the case. Sometimes this will be a man who's the man who's never in the running. He actually is responsible and performs his work well, but he's always in a subordinate position in relation to the heroine. We see Eddie Willers in this situation. He is literally Dagny Taggart's assistant, but he's never her equal, let alone someone who can take command in her absence, or operate independently of her, or be her shelter within the storm. So let's go examine these types of characters in the Avatar universe in the order of the anomaly, then too cold, too hot, and then just right. So the anomaly, please don't throw stones. In the Avatar universe, Katang is the anomalous suitor who is not fitting into the Goldilocks pattern, and therefore we will find out why it isn't a satisfying ending for him to be ultimately paired off with her. When he meets her, Katara is functioning as the adult. She's running her family's household. Despite the presence of her grandmother, she's the mother figure for her older brother, despite the presence of her grandmother. Kind of makes you wonder what was going on in that family. And Katara no longer sees herself as a kid. Her childhood essentially ended with the death of her mother. And in fact, in the first episode, we see Katara making a distinction between herself and Aang when they go sledding. You know, she's having a good time and says she hasn't done this since she was a kid. Aang replies that she still is a kid, but the audience already understands what's been set up here. Katara is not a kid the same way that Aang is. Katara has taken on the mantle of adult responsibilities and has done so for several years at the time of their meeting. Aang is, apart from being the Avatar, average 12-year-old boy, and he has a psychology of such, regardless of how much talent that he has and the fact that he was born into his particular office. He's still just a 12-year-old kid. But Aang sees himself as being on a level playing with Katara, even though it's clear that Katara does not share this view. So he has a crush on her practically from the first moments of seeing her, but Katara just instantly goes into mother mode with Aang, just as she did with Sokka upon the loss of their mother. So the trio begins their adventures, and we see Katara being the caretaker. She's cooking, she's cleaning, she's mending, healing the boo-boos, showing empathy to emotional wounds, even managing the money because no one else is being responsible with it. But what we don't see is anyone taking care of her back, and this creates a distance between herself and the rest of the group, even when the group later gains another member in Toph. Katara is the mother, the de facto authority figure, and she doesn't relate to the others on terms of equality. Now, Sokka once refers to Aang as being Katara's boyfriend, once. In the second episode, I believe, and Katara poo-poos the idea. In fact, in later episodes, she describes Aang as just a good friend, like Momo. In case you are unaware, Momo was a flying lemur and a pet. Aang was placed on the level of a pet. If that doesn't say what his standing was with Katara, I really don't know what does. And let's also keep in mind, at the beginning of the story, Aang is all of 12. And at the end of the story, he may be 13-ish. Katara, at the beginning of the story, is 14, and by the end, quite likely, is 15, and it shows. And the way they present her, the way she's dressed, her mannerisms, it's obvious that during the course of the story, we're supposed to see her as someone who is matured, and someone who is becoming appealing to potential romantic partners. Now, while it would be normal for a 12, 13-year-old boy, someone who's in the 6th or 7th grade, to have a crush on a 14 or 15-year-old girl, it is not normal in the slightest for a 14, 15-year-old girl to have a crush on a 13, 12-year-old. Would a freshman in high school want to date a 7th grader, especially if the girl is the elder? I think not. We all know it because that's what our life experience and our culture has shown us. A 2-year gap with a guy when he's younger, it isn't as big of a deal when you're in your 20s or 30s or beyond, but in those crucial tween years and the teen years, which are a rapid period of psychological development, it means everything. Age is more than just a number. It represents a stage of development, and there's no sense pretending it doesn't. And so it becomes a struggle for the audience to suspend disbelief that Katara would actually get together with Aang, or that it would make sense if she did. Now, before anyone points out possible exceptions to this rule, I will make this observation. In the extremely rare case of an older teenage girl having a crush on someone younger than herself, we can expect a few things. Number one, the guy will be taller than she is and appear to at least be her age at first glance, might even looking a little bit older for his age. He's probably someone who's going to be looking overtly masculine, and in some way he probably makes her feel like she is protected and gives her a sense of safety. Aang is shorter than Katara and has the expected maturity level for a 12-year-old, but as Toph would say, he is more in touch with his feminine side. And Aang is someone who is protected by Katara on a regular basis rather than being her protector. Add on to this, Aang is easily distracted from the task at hand. At the outset, we learn that he needs to master all 4 elements, and the first on the list is water, and he has to travel to the North Pole in order to get this done, which just happens to be on the opposite side of the world from where he started. So instead of making a beeline for the North Pole, Aang is wanting to go here, there, and everywhere. He's constantly stopping, constantly goofing off, and when he does arrive at the North Pole, he's not exactly a dedicated student, which is why Katara makes rapid progress in her training and is considered ready to be by the waterbending master to become Aang's instructor, and Aang is not yet mastered it. This represents another level of inequality between Katara and Aang, as well as showing Aang's immaturity and unwillingness to face his responsibilities. And I don't say this to be mean about Aang. He's reacting in a perfectly normal way for a boy his age. It's just because he's normal for a boy his age in that regard, it means that he's not going to be able to come up to Katara's level. Another issue is that Aang shuts down emotionally and he runs in difficult situations, or he explodes into the Avatar state, one of the two. When he was informed that he was the Avatar, 4 years earlier than what was customary, he was overwhelmed. He resisted anything about his life changing, and ultimately he ran away, and that led directly to him being frozen in the iceberg and out of commission for 100 years while the Fire Nation was wreaking havoc on the world. When Aang came face to face with the fact of the air nomad's extinction, instead of facing the reality of it, which would be horrible for anyone at any age, he blanked out into the Avatar state, and he was about to go absolutely nuts before he would probably run away again to not face the pain, and it took Mommy Katara to talk him down. Then, later on, Aang was confronted by a fisherman who let him know that his evasion of his duties had led to the current troubles of the world. Aang flew away on his air glider. Later on, it once again took Mommy Katara to persuade him to focus on doing good in the present and letting past mistakes go. Then, Appa, who was Aang's flying bison and his spirit animal and companion, he was stolen, and Aang flipped out into the Avatar state on the thieves. Mommy Katara once again had to talk him down and bring him back to sanity. When Aang was mentored by the chakra guru and told he needed to let his feelings for Katara go in order to master the last chakra and consequently the Avatar state, he then ran away. This endangered his ability to function as the Avatar. It led to a blocked chakra, which prevented him from going into the Avatar state, and he continued to cling to his one-sided feelings for Katara. Aang was once again actively and knowingly fleeing from his duty. Now, about that pesky chakra, he did manage to unlock it briefly in the middle of a fight, and while he was going through this process, Katara just had to cope on her own until he was done sorting that out. However, it didn't do very much good in the end, because while he was in that, when he emerged and he was in the Avatar state, he was hit by a lightning strike, courtesy of Zuko's sister, Azula. And then we see him fall to the ground, lifeless, and Katara picks him up. Now, it's a very interesting pose she's right in, because apparently it's an exact copy of a statue of the Virgin Mary holding the body of Jesus after his crucifixion. It's a sight of a mother holding her dead son, and with all the grief that entails. Now, Katara manages to escape with Aang, and she successfully heals him with the spirit water that was taken from a temple in the North Pole that was purported to have special properties. Essentially, she's performing a resurrection, and this mirrors the role of the Lady of the Lake from Arthurian legend, who receives the body of the fallen author and prophesies his return in Britain's greatest hour of need. So again, she's taken on this mythic, matriarchal kind of role. Now, when Aang comes to, he has a blocked chakra again, can't go into the Avatar state, and he's not adjusting well to this. He quickly abandons the whole gang, thinking he has to go out to try to win this war by himself to restore his honor. Now, even after he accepts that he does need his team, and there's nothing wrong with that, Aang is still blocked from the Avatar state, hasn't learned to let go of Katara, or even considered the possibility that he might not win her over in the end. And he certainly is not considering the possibility that his feelings for her are ultimately an illusion. So days before the final battle, Aang is crippled with anxiety because he suddenly realizes that defeating the Fire Lord, which has always been kind of this vague and undefined goal, it may require killing the Fire Lord, which is as concrete a reality as it gets. Once again, he runs off, and later in that episode, he gets curious about an island he sees on the horizon on the ocean, wanders off to it, and thus running away even further. This is the same impulse that led him to getting stuck in the block of ice for 100 years. He literally has not evolved. Now, while he's on the Lion Turtle Island, he's doing some meditation, and he's summoning different versions of his past lives. Now, after he's doing this, keep in mind, Aang has already refused to listen to the viewpoints of his friends and allies. Instead, he's insisting that any solution has to conform to his ideas and perceptions of morality, is not willing to accept that maybe his ideas are wrong, and he runs away from the idea that accommodating his preferences may not be possible in the circumstances. Now again, he's 12, 13-ish at this point. It is completely understandable that he wouldn't be gung-ho to kill the Fire Lord. That's a burden that no 13-year-old should ever have to bear, even in times of war. However, if we could briefly consider what would happen if instead of being 12 or 13, Aang was 22 at this time, or in his early 30s. Would we have been as understanding of Aang not wanting to take the Fire Lord's life if he was a grown man? Would we still be talking about how moral a choice that was and how enlightened it was? Or would we see his squeamishness as something else? It's worth thinking about. Now, of course, he's young, and the idea of having to take a fight that far, that really is not something that anyone that age should have to deal with. But let's move along. So Aang's on the Lion Turtle Island. He is meditating with his past lives. He sees 4 different versions, fire, earth, water, air nomad. He's talking to all of the various options and getting their point of views. And he ends up rejecting their counsel of all 4 of those past lives. And they essentially all said, in slightly different ways, that if push comes to shove, Aang's duty is to prioritize the well-being of the world over Ozai's well-being. Now, Ozai, just to be clear, was, the Fire Lord, but he wasn't just intent on conquering his neighbors. In this final battle, he had ordered and he was overseeing a genocide, a complete scorched earth genocide, destroy all the plant life, all the animal, all of the people. Is that really someone whose safety and well-being we need to worry about? Just a thought. But the point is that Aang still doesn't believe that anything about his thinking is an error, or that there's a possibility that he could be an error. He's mad and he's discouraged by the advice he receives. Now this culminates in him meeting the actual lion turtle. Now this is a being that can bestow bending abilities upon people, and it was only mentioned as existing once before in a previous season. And he magically gave Aang a kind of bending that no one had ever heard before, and the story hadn't even hinted at being possible. This enabled Aang to defeat the Fire Lord by taking away his ability to bend, thus partially eliminating the threat he posed to the world. Now, this is a good thing because Aang did not have to take the ultimate option. However, it's a bad thing for Aang as a character development and for the story because Aang did not have to confront his beliefs. He did not have to evolve. He didn't even have to make a conscious choice. He got a cop-out, and he took it. Now, because the show was intended for children, this chain of events is completely understandable. In children's media, we do not generally see the good guys killing anybody. Beating up bad guys, sure. Killing anybody, no. But this is still a deus machina, the god that swings into the rescue. And it's just an easy out. Aang doesn't have to grow. He's not required to. So the Aang we see in this final episode is still very much the Aang we see in the first episode. If we look at this chain of events through Katara's eyes, what reason would she have to conclude that Aang would grow up to become a reliable romantic partner, let alone that he would be suitable for her to date in the here and now? Assuming responsibility, it's one of the characteristics that changes a boy into a man. Aang has a pattern of evading responsibility. That is not an attractive trait, and it absolutely disqualifies him from being a suitable romantic partner for Katara, even if they had been the same age, even if they had made his character older. His conduct, in addition to the reality of his age and his psychological development, is what disqualifies him. Again, we see Katara shouldering the duties of adulthood and motherhood, but Aang is still a boy, and he has yet to begin his journey towards becoming a man. There's no reason why the audience should believe that Katara would see Aang as someone she would want to be her boyfriend. So let's move on to another issue, namely that Aang's romantic overtures fall consistently flat. When Katara loses her mother's necklace, Aang makes Katara a replacement one. It is the one and only time we see Katara wear it. Clearly, the gesture means more to Aang than it does to Katara, again confirming she lacks romantic feelings for him. Now, a moment. Okay. In the Cave of Two Lovers, when they're trapped and Katara has run out of all ideas, she suggested that they take the legend literally. And the legend of the Cave of Two Lovers is that love would show you the way in the dark. So she said, well, what if we kiss and just see what happens? Maybe it'll open a door, or there'll be some kind of something that happens that will give us an escape route. Now, Aang certainly wanted to be on kissing terms with Katara, but he did kind of bungle the situation and the opportunity to do so. And it's interesting that even though there's an implication that they might have kissed, we don't actually see it. We see the candlelight fading, their faces are close like this together, but they stop. They're not moving forward as the candlelight goes completely out, and then poof, it's dark, and we see there are markings on the ceilings and walls that have some kind of glow-in-the-dark properties, and they're pointing to the direction to the exit. Katara immediately follows the trail, completely abandoning any idea of kissing Aang and ignoring his attempt to discuss it. A few seasons later, we see that Aang is throwing a dance party in the Fire Nation after he temporarily goes to school there, and he is dancing with Katara in an overtly romantic way. But earlier in that episode, Katara was disguised as his mother, complete with a pillow simulating a pregnant belly, because he got called to the principal's office. And in the next episode, the issue of Katara's mothering tendencies, as well as being a bit overbearing at times, came up, and she was at, her most stressed out, dealing with the kids all by herself and getting too strict version of herself that we saw in the series. Aang at this point was yes-mamming her, after she nagged him about, sitting up straight and speaking clearly and all that stuff. This is another example of the dance, a Katang moment that had zero impact on the relationship norms between Aang and Katara. And in this instance, the parent-child relationship was immediately reinforced. Now we come to the invasion of the Fire Nation. Aang kisses Katara goodbye, quite unexpectedly, before flying off to face the Fire Lord. Katara is obviously shocked. She does not kiss back and afterwards look off to the side as if to say, "Oh, good God, I cannot believe that happened. What do I do now? Maybe if I just ignore it, this will go away." And so, clearly, that kiss was not on her list of things to do, and it took her completely off guard. Now, this would not have been the case if she actually harbored romantic feelings for Aang. And after that failed invasion, Aang was, back in his mode, trying to distract himself from reality, running psychologically, even if not yet running physically, whereas Katara and Sokka were trying to get him back on task. Say, we need to discuss what happens next in the war. We need to strategize. We need to start making plans. We need to decide what to do. Katara is in mom mode. Then later on, the gang is at Ember Island and they're attending a play. And Aang is all manner of upset about this play. In a previous episode, it was established that Ember Island had a way of revealing the truth about people. Now, Aang does not know this, but we as the audience do. And while the play is an exaggeration, what's shown on stage does have a kernel of truth to it. And Aang is getting all bent out of shape because, one, from the get-go, Zuko sat next to Katara as if it was the daily routine, when Aang wanted to sit next to her, and Zuko didn't move, even asking, "What's the big deal? Just sit next to me." Obviously it hadn't entered Zuko's mind that there was a romantic connection between Aang and Katara, and he was around them all the time at that point, so that speaks volumes. So Aang was already hacked off. Then, two, the play portrays the scene in the crystal cave between Zuko and Katara as overtly romantic, and it also conveyed the idea that Katara only saw Aang as a brother. And then three, during the intermission, Aang confronts Katara about things that took place in the play and forced the issue about, "Why aren't we together?" Katara looks deeply uncomfortable, and she tries to sidestep the issue, as one does when one is trying to let a guy down gently. And I would just like to say, and I'm joining the chorus of other women who have made this observation, when we are watching this scene, we understand what this is. We know that this is rejection. We know that this is the guy who's your friend, who you're fond of, and you don't want to hurt his feelings, but you also don't want to encourage him and give him the wrong idea, and you would really like him to stop nagging you about the idea of maybe thinking of him in a different way. We know that's what this is, and we know the process we go through when we're trying to say no, but be kind about it. Aang's not getting the hint. He kisses her, which was definitely not wanted, and then Katara rejects his advances in no uncertain terms. That is the big no. And again, a lot of us women have been in Katara's shoes. We have had to do what she had to do when someone wasn't getting the message, and then finally we had to be blunt, even harsh, before the message even started to get through. So we know what this is. We know that by all rights and by all patterns of human behavior, that's it for Aang. That's done. Now, this is all part of a pattern that is very revealing. Aang wants something that Katara doesn't. He's not getting the hint that she just wants to be his friend and can carry on being the mother figure. This brings us to another issue. The ongoing problem of Aang simply not understanding Katara. He has an idealized version of her in his head, and he reacts very badly when she deviates from this image, and he isn't able to ignore it and pretend it isn't happening. The most notorious example of this is during the Southern Raiders episode. Katara is very upset. Azula's attack on the Air Temple has resulted in her and Sokka being separated from their father once again. She's taking her frustrations out on Zuko, and her emotions are all kinds of displaced. Zuko understands that Katara needs to face her demons, get some closure, and realizes he can help her locate her mother's killers, and offers to do so. Aang gets thoroughly against this plan, and he tries to prevent Katara from going. Katara is exasperated and angry and says, she knew he wouldn't understand. And of course he doesn't. He's not operating on the same emotional level as she is. There's no way he could possibly relate to her in this situation. And this is where Katara gets criticized, because she does end up saying some very harsh things, even brutal things, to both Aang and Sokka, and who have both experienced loss. But is the criticism really fair? Now, it's true, Aang lost all of his people. But the issue of him having lost his entire culture, it only seldom arises in the story. It's only when that loss is tied in with a plot point of the story that it even comes up. Otherwise, Aang is just, he's moved on. It is what it is, nothing to be done about it now, and he's just going forward. It is also true that Aang suffered loss when Appa was stolen. But is it fair to compare the loss of a beloved animal who was recovered to the loss of a dead parent who's never coming back and died as a consequence of protecting their child? Now, Aang's emotion, while they can be very loud, don't tend to run deep. And the philosophy of the air nomads preached having a free spirit as the highest ideal and value, complete detachment from the world, and that included, at least so far as what was humanly possible, freedom from grief. Aang is reacting in a way that is consistent with his cultural and his upbringing. Katara is from a very different culture. It isn't about freedom from emotional ties. It isn't about, freedom from attachment to the world. If anything, the Water Tribe is, revolves around the idea of attachment. Very deep family roots, strong sense of community. And the loss of her mother absolutely shaped her character, and it forever altered the course of her life. Now again, it is true that Katara's mother was also Sokka's mother, and of course Sokka felt his mother's loss. However, as Sokka himself admitted, when he tries to picture his mother's face, he can now only see Katara's face. And that's because she stepped up and she became the mom and she looked after him as best as she could. Yes, Sokka lost his mother, but he still had a strong, present, and involved mother figure. Katara did not. Isn't it reasonable to assume that as a consequence of this, she feels the loss of her mother more keenly or in a different way than Sokka does? And let's keep in mind, this is one of the very, very rare times when we see Katara doing something for herself, instead of setting her personal desires to one side and putting the rest of the group, her de facto children, in first place. Neither Sokka nor Aang are accustomed to this, and they are not able to understand her point of view, just like a child is often unable to understand a parent that tells them no about something because the parent needs to take a moment to take care of themselves or other necessary business. This just further illustrates that Aang expects Katara to take care of him and doesn't know how or understand why it would be necessary to step up and take care of her. At this turbulent and vulnerable moment in Katara's life, the person by her side, supporting her, being there for what she needed, not insinuating his preferences, taking care of her, was Zuko, not Aang. From a storytelling point of view, this could be seen as a test for Aang. Is he growing up? Is he in tune with Katara on a meaningful level? Can he sacrifice his wants and needs for her sake if needs be? Aang failed this test, but Zuko did not. When Katara returned, after refraining from killing her mother's murderer, Aang once again misunderstood Katara's reasoning and feelings. He thought that she exercised forgiveness and rejected violence as a solution. The reality is that the killer was already an empty and defeated shell of a man who had nothing left inside of him. She didn't kill him because she was leaving him to rot in his pathetic state. This was not forgiveness. This wasn't mercy. It wasn't even rejecting violence. There was just nothing left to kill. Katara was obviously irritated by Aang's misinterpretation of her decision and his complete lack of understanding of her emotions. After rebuking Aang and essentially trying to teach him a lesson to re-examine his ideas, Katara turns to Zuko and declared her readiness to forgive him for past wrongs. She jumped into his arms. They held onto each other tightly and they looked into each other's eyes for a long moment before Katara let go of Zuko and exited the scene. This experience did not cause Aang to look at Katara through more realistic eyes. He just deleted what he didn't wish to see and clung to his idealized illusions all the more tightly. I think this paints a very clear picture of why it really isn't for Aang to become the man in Katara's life. Not after what we've seen. Now, too cold. This refers to Katara and Haru. Haru is someone who was of a suitable age for Katara when we meet him. So an interaction begins to make sense just on that grounds alone. They're already on equal terms. They have other common ground. Katara and Haru are both benders. They have both suffered because of the Fire Nation. Katara's mother was killed, Haru's father was arrested and drug off to a camp. And they both share a strong sense of community and family. And of course, they treat each other as equals, and they are more open with each other emotionally than Katara is to her brother or to Aang. So already we're seeing a different dynamic. But here's why it doesn't actually work between them. Katara is a more proactive person. Haru needs a little more outside leadership, as was seen when Katara arranged to break Haru, his father, and the other earthbenders out of prison. The next time we meet Haru is during the invasion of the Fire Nation. Now, he's grown up, and Katara obviously remembers him fondly, and he her. But while Haru has become that good soldier, he still isn't a leader, which would mean any connection with Katara would involve her constantly having to lead instead of them pulling together as a team. This is made even more obvious when Team Avatar escapes after the failed invasion. Haru is amongst the survivors, but he doesn't go on to have an active role, particularly when it comes to strategy and other major decisions of the group. Interestingly, when Katara is once challenged that she may have had a secret thing with Haru, courtesy of Toph, of course, she was puzzled by this, but she wasn't offended by the idea. She likes Haru, she respects him, she gets along with him, but there just isn't enough there to become more, and Katara has obviously concluded that for herself. And Haru probably has too. When the group splits up when the air temple is attacked, Haru goes with one group and Katara goes off with another. Literally and figuratively, they part ways, and it makes perfect sense for them to do so. Now this brings us to the too hot option, which of course is Katara and Jet. This is another attraction that makes sense. Jet is dynamic and exciting. He has outstanding people skills, and he's a natural leader. He lost his family in the war, but formed a new family of orphans and refugees. This appeals to Katara's innate sense of being family-oriented. She lost her mom. She became the mom. She's now creating her own family with Sokka and Aang at this point. Now, when Jet was referred to as being Katara's boyfriend by Sokka, Katara didn't deny that, and just addressed the rest of Sokka's statement, like, he's not a thug, not, he's not my boyfriend. It was just, no, Jet's not a thug. How could you think that? So clearly the connection between Katara and Jet had romantic overtones, and there was some mutuality about that. Now later on, when Toph inquired if Jet was Katara's boyfriend or an ex-boyfriend, Katara was all huffy and defensive, obviously still heard from their shared history, and again confirming the romantic, and that does confirm the romantic link between the two. Another reason why attraction makes sense is because of Jet's strong sense of purpose. He doesn't require external motivation, so, Katara wouldn't have to be, his get up and go. He has plenty of drive. He zealously pursues his mission, which is to wage war on the Fire Nation and take revenge for his losses. Katara has a similar mission. She wants the war to end, and she needs the Fire Nation to stop doing what it's doing. Now that she's left her home village and taken action, she will see her purpose through to the end, just as Jet is inclined to see his mission through to the very end. Another reason for the attraction is that Jet is in command of his group. If Katara and Jet had forged a lasting partnership, she wouldn't have had to bear the burden of being in charge and being the mommy all of the time. This episode is the first in which we see Katara outside of her mothering role, and she's just herself. She's just a person, a young lady who's fallen head over heels for the wrong guy, but she can relax, she can be herself. Here's why it doesn't work. Jet is reckless and hot-headed and blinded by his rage and loss. This leads him to engage in immoral and ruthless tactics which punish people who are not guilty of any crime. Instead of security, Jet can only offer drama, upheaval, and a war without end. He would not be able to see members of the Fire Nation as people at the end of the war, and he would probably never feel that they'd been punished enough or lessened his own personal prejudices. This would not have helped Katara in evolving past a Fire Nation bad mindset and into a post-war, we're all people, we've all suffered, it's time to move on and build a better future mindset. Now, as you're probably aware if you've watched the season, Jet does die in the second season, and obviously that ends any possibility of him evolving and becoming worthy of Katara. However, if he had lived, can you imagine him successfully adjusting to that post-war world and moving forward in his life? What would be his new purpose that he could pursue with all the passion, energy, and drive that he did when he was at war with the Fire Nation? Who is he if Jet isn't a warrior with a gang of loyalists fighting the good fight? Now, after his death, of course, we'll never know. And it does serve the narrative for him to die as heroically as he did, because it is very hard to envision him being able to make that big leap. However, we cannot talk about Jet's death without making mention of this honorable moment. We have to give him props for how he faced his own mortality. He knew he wasn't going to make it, but he was brave to the end, and he spared Katara the sight of him dying before her very eyes. He comforted and reassured her, and he persuaded her to go with Team Avatar and leave him behind, literally and figuratively, so she could live to fight another day. And this also served the purpose of keeping her safe. This was honorable and courageous behavior, and it shows that he did sincerely care for Katara, even if he wouldn't have been right for her in the end. And say what we will of Jet's flaws and mistakes, in his final moments, he acted in a manner befitting a grown man many years his senior. It's impossible not to respect that, and kudos to the writers of the series for handling it that way. So now, the moment we have all been waiting for, the argument in favor of the just right option, which of course is Katara and Zuko. Gonna need another drink. Alright. When we meet Zuko, he is the disgraced Fire Nation prince, and he has a huge scar on his face, courtesy of his father, as we later learn. And he's been thoroughly convinced that the only way he can restore his honor is by capturing the Avatar, long since believed to be dead, and that the cycle of Avatars is broken, and bringing him back into the Fire Nations and chains as a gift to his father to restore his position, his honor, get his father's love and approval, all of that stuff. Obviously, Zuko's morals are flawed at this point, and his behavior shows it. However, he does have the benefit of Uncle Iroh, who is working with him and gradually breaking through the Fire Nation indoctrination and getting Zuko to open up his mind and think more independently. However, despite having all the wrong ideas in his head, Zuko is deeply concerned with the idea of honor and taking right action. His instinct is to satisfy moral standards, not define them, even though he can't properly describe what moral standards really are. His motivations are in the right place. He wants to do the right thing. He hasn't rejected the idea of morality and ethics. And his mistakes reflect a misunderstanding of what those things are. But as he evolves through the story, so do his behaviors and choices, bringing him back into proper alignment. And despite being in disrepute in the eyes of his people, it is a fact that Zuko is still the captain of his ship, and that his Uncle Iroh is actively grooming him for leadership. He's not running from his responsibilities and obligations. He's embracing them with the whole of his being. He wants to progress from the awkwardness of adolescence into the maturity of a grown man. Now, the beginnings of the Zutara shipping. It's when he picks up Katara's mother's necklace. In the same episode we meet Haru, we also discover that Katara's necklace, her mother's betrothal necklace no less, which is worn in her honor and memory, is accidentally left behind on the rescue mission. Zuko arrives at the prison and he's doing an investigation, and he finds that necklace and keeps it. Imagine, if you will, Zuko holding Katara's necklace, her most intimate and personal possession, and Katara losing it to Zuko is symbolic in and of itself. But on the off chance that there could be children watching this, we won't really get into that murky territory. And while he's holding her necklace, this sacred possession of hers, he's staring into the sunset. Sunsets are notoriously used as the backdrop of romances, and it's very strange that he would be staring into the sunset at this point. Now, and a few episodes down the road, he captures Katara, and we get the infamous "I'll save you from the pirates" line. And this is also the first instance of physical contact between the two, and he grabs her by the wrist. Yes, it was very forceful the way he did this, and no, they were not on friendly terms on this point. But capturing someone by the wrist, the hold is in and of itself intimate and has a stop what you're doing and pay attention to me undertones to it. It's subtext for more adult things. He then attempts to get Katara to help him by trapping the Avatar, and he offers the necklace in exchange. Obviously, Katara refuses. You know, Zuko's not the only one who has a sense of honor, and Katara's moral compass is not as bent out of shape as his is. And despite the situation, and being a prisoner, she is not afraid of Zuko. She's not afraid of what he might do. And Zuko, oddly, isn't yelling, and he's a yeller. He yells at everybody. And even more oddly, despite the fact she is his prisoner in that moment, he's still treating her nicely, well, better at least, than other people he encounters, including his own uncle. He's being very open and forthright about his reasons and goals, about why he's captured her, why he wants to capture the Avatar, what that would accomplish. And he's not displaying any kind of personal rancor. He's not threatening her. And oddly, during this exchange, at one point he's all but whispering in her ear, as he's kind of circling her around. And while Katara is annoyed with him during this, and she's frustrated with the situation, and she's obviously ready and willing to kick his butt, she doesn't appear creeped out or frightened or even particularly worried. She's annoyed more than anything else. And when Katara and the gang escape, Zuko still has the necklace. It is only many episodes down the road that we find out that the necklace can be used for its scent to track down Katara and, by extension, the Avatar. Zuko was not aware of this possibility when he took the necklace or when he kept the necklace even after his encounter with Katara. He did not know that. Apparently he was just had it tucked in his pocket all this while for no particular reason. Okay, sure. Holding on to something that belongs to a girl is for no reason is, yeah, sure, guys do that all the time. Of course they do. Whatever. Now, the tracker accused Zuko of wanting to use the necklace to track down his girlfriend. And this, of course, is a hint that one day that the relationship between Zuko and Katara will change. They are at odds because they're on opposite sides of a war and they have conflicting goals. But their argument is not the result of personal differences. And this leaves the door open to future understanding and resolution. Now, close to the finale of the series, we see this tracker again, who remembers Zuko and the necklace, and when she sees it on Katara, her opening statement was, "See you work things out with your girlfriend." Despite the flustered protestations to the contrary, it's clear that the tracker isn't buying their excuses, and neither is the audience. "Methink the lady doth protest too much." That has become an axiom for a reason, and it's not uncommon for people who are attracted to each other, are moving towards a relationship of some kind, but haven't openly acknowledged that to each other, let alone the rest of the world, to be a little standoffish in public when they're called out like that. So their reactions are not a sign that there's nothing between them. If anything, it's further confirmation. Now, on a side note, when this necklace is used to track Katara, the scent vapors are portrayed as purple. Purple is the combination of red and blue, fire and water. Zuko and Katara? Unified? Now later when the tracker was hired to locate Uncle Iroh via an old sandal of his, Uncle Iroh's scent wasn't purple. It was a dingy brown awfulness. So clearly, if purple was just the visual representation of scent, it would have been purple in that case as well. But it wasn't. Interesting inclusion of a detail, very subtle. If the intention is to create the idea that Zuko and Katara is misdirection, it's a false lead, they're not really the end-game pairing, It just seems like this is a lot of hard work to imply that they are. A lot of teeny tiny little details. And keep in mind throughout all of this that everything we see and hear in animation is in consequence of deliberate choices on the part of the creators. It's not as if in live action, if you discover that two actors just have a kind of chemistry that just shows out there on the screen and no one can really help it. Everything we are seeing in the animation is just what was meant to be there, what was approved to be there. So if Zutara wasn't intended to be in-game, why weave this symbolism and these tiny little clues in the show? Next, we go back to the Cave of Two Lovers and the Crystal Cave that we see in the Crossroads of Destiny. We're going to notice a few things here. The Cave of Two Lovers. Now, the legend behind the Cave of Two Lovers is that there were warring tribes, and a couple from these opposing sides fell in love and they met in secret. They were thought to have learned earthbending to be able to meet without suspicion or opposition. The couple was illustrated as a woman wearing red and a man wearing blue. So again, we have that red and blue color coordination relating to Zuko and Katara. This is very odd. The dominant color for the Earth Kingdom is green, and we see some golds. And this is a story about an Earth Kingdom couple, so why wouldn't they be pictured in Earth Kingdom colors? I mean, the clothing, the surroundings of each nation has been very specifically color-coded, right down to their environments, with very rare and notable exceptions. So again, why are these forbidden lovers shown in red and blue? Unless it's also mirroring other forbidden lovers in our story, a potential relationship between Zuko and Katara in their colors, if the implication is not that their relationship will one day develop along romantic lines. Now, this legend also said that to escape the cavern, travelers would need to let love show the way. This can be a metaphor for love having the power to forge a path, allowing people who wouldn't be allowed to be together to overcome the obstacles in their path. And the cave in this cavern had glow-in-the-dark symbols that were in this beautiful emerald green. Later on, when we go to the Crystal Cave, it is all emerald green, and it has similar lighting conditions, so it's a very interesting pair of bookends right there. Now, the symbolism of caves is, for one, they are very private, and where there's privacy, there is intimacy. It's a mask-off time, and all you are left with is the truth. It strips all of the pretensions away. Caves can also be a symbol of the womb, and wombs give new life, new possibility. That's how it all comes forth. So are we seeing the possibility of something new coming forth from the interactions and symbolism of these caves? Now, the Cave of Two Lovers planted the seeds of the idea of the forbidden lovers coming together, and the Crystal Cave nurtured that seed. It showed us that there was a possibility for a deeper understanding, emotional connectivity, and romantic intimacy. Next point, and this is a biggie. Zuko is literally the only character we ever see taking care of Katara. When Zuko joined the gang, there was understandable suspicion and initial distrust. However, Katara's distrust was on a whole other level and was clearly emotionally driven. Katara outright threatened Zuko's life if he did anything to harm Aang. Katang supporters can, and do, point to this moment as proof positive that Katara was really in love with Aang all along. Otherwise, why would she go so far with such a dastardly threat? However, this viewpoint is not as rock-solid as it might first appear. For one, while it is natural for a woman to be protective of her man and to express that, it also follows that she doesn't usually want to give the idea, particularly to a potential or opponent or a potential enemy, that her man is somehow unable to help himself and that he needs her protection. When making death threats and avoiding making the man in her life look weak, it would make sense for Katara to have gathered the whole gang together, albeit behind Aang's back, and as a group issue that threat to Zuko. Something along the lines of, we're all loyal to Aang here, so we're keeping a close eye at you, and at the first sign of betrayal, we all take action because we've got our guys back. He's going to give you a chance, but if you disappoint him, we're going to make you sorry. That kind of thing. This is a kind of threat that wouldn't diminish Aang's standing, but it would demonstrate his ability to gain people's support. to such an extent they would be willing to take incredibly drastic action if the situation called for it. But that's not what we saw. What we see is Katara confronting Zuko alone. So is this a woman defending her man? Or are we watching Mama Bear protect her cub? Imagine a single mother, which is what Katara has essentially been this whole time, and suddenly the father of her children drops in out of the blue announcing his intention to be part of their lives. Now, while the kids are watching, the mom says, "It's good you want to spend time with the kids. They've missed having you around. We'll see how this goes." But when the kids are out of hearing range, the mom then turns on the dad and tells him in no uncertain terms that if he disappears or lets the kids down in any way, she's going to beat his ass and keep him away from the kids for good. Obviously, what we are seeing is more consistent with that kind of scenario. Katara is protecting Aang as if he was her own child. Now, in the next episodes, we watch Zuko easily and naturally take the role of father figure for the rest of the group. He takes Aang on a little field trip to find the original firebenders. Katara made no objection. She's very snarky towards Zuko at this point, but she does nothing to prevent him from taking Aang on a multi-day field trip and essentially training him in firebending as Zuko sees fit. Then we have Sokka. Sokka comes to figure out where his captured father is being held prisoner, most likely, and he tries to sneak out in true teenager fashion to go and rescue Dad. Zuko is waiting for him just as Sokka gets ready to leave, just like a parent catching their kid coming in way too late at night. It was that kind of vibe. Now, Zuko ultimately decides to take Sokka on this mission, and this mission is all the more difficult because the prison up to that point had never had a successful prison break. And Katara never said a word against this and didn't fuss when they came back. So the question arises, is her distrust of Zuko really the issue? Is this really the problem right now? Because she clearly trusts him enough with two of her de facto children. So is it a possibility that maybe this is just about her being angry with Zuko for other reasons? Let's examine Katara getting angry. We see her getting truly angry with three different characters: Jet, her father, and Zuko. Katara was very angry with Jet because he betrayed her trust. It left her feeling abandoned and alone. Katara was angry with her father because he went off to war, and she was the sole caretaker of Sokka, her grandmother, and the village in general. She felt alone and abandoned. Katara was supremely angry with Zuko after betraying her trust. They had been connecting on a personal and a deeply emotional level. He was a potential ally for her cause, and in consequence of this betrayal, Aang ended up getting gravely wounded. And she was once again alone and abandoned to bear the burdens all by herself. When Jet came back into her life, she attacked him with her waterbending and was all manner of angry before being semi-civil. When her father came back in her life, Katara was resentful, cold, and distant before having an emotional reconciliation and reaching a new understanding with her dad. When Zuko came back in her life, she was angry, hurt, suspicious. So what happened to get beyond this point? We see the beginnings of a turnaround when Azula decides to attack the air temple. And during this attack, the ceiling of the temple begins to cave in. Zuko runs from across the room, literally shoving other people out of the way to save Katara. He rolls them both out from under the rock, shielding her with his own body. Katara's, a little annoyed, underlining that she's still punishing him, even in a situation like this. And while Zuko's taken aback at her reaction, this doesn't change anything about his willingness to protect her and help her. Now, in order to escape, the gang is forced to split up. And of course, Katara and Sokka's father ends up going with the other group, and Katara, once again, is separated from a cherished parent because of action taken by the Fire Nation. And her resentment for everything she's personally suffered in the war is just bubbling up to the surface. All of her issues are just right up on top right now. Now, despite this, Zuko Eventually, during this attack, he's fighting Azula one-on-one. He ends up falling, and the gang flies underneath him with Appa, and they save him. And it is Katara who reaches out, grabs him in hand, and brings him to safety. Once again, I want to reemphasize, everything we're seeing in animation is a deliberate choice. We are meant to see them saving each other in quick succession all during this attack. Think back to, the idea of push and pull, yin and yang, masculine and feminine. Even when their relationship is in a bad place, they are still watching each other's backs. You only do that if there is something else there. So once they are safely away, the whole gang, and they've made camp for the night, most of the gang is celebrating. They got away successfully. They can live and fight another day. But Katara is very morose, and she's very unhappy. She makes a biting comment at Zuko, and this catches the attention of the entire group, who more or less has been kind of not really paying any attention to it. She's not exactly nice to Zuko, even though Katara, as a general rule, is nice to everybody. But she ends up walking away from the campfire. Everyone asks Zuko, what was that all about? He says he doesn't know, and goes after her in order to find out. He's not afraid to face her, even when he knows she's angry and upset and hurting. And you also got to think about the scenery for this conversation. It's a stormy sky, a turbulent ocean in the background, and of course water, tribe, emotions, the feminine. Lots of symbolism going here. Now, unlike Zuko's arguments that he's had with May, the character who was his Fire Nation girlfriend when he returned briefly, Katara is just venting all of her emotions on Zuko. She's holding nothing back. She's being very open about he betrayed her trust. She's so furious about this. And he asks, what can he do to make it up? And Katara says, I don't know. And then she says, well, maybe you could bring my mother back. Obviously an unreasonable request. And it says that she doesn't think he can do anything to make her feel better. Katara, on a very deep level, doesn't believe that anyone can make her feel better or help bring her peace or be the shelter in her own personal storm, which makes the surrounding scenery of, the storm and that angry ocean all the more poignant. It's literally reflecting where Katara is emotionally in that moment. And she doesn't think anyone is ever going to be there to help her and who can take care of her and lessen some of her burdens. Zuko realizes right now that everything that's bothering Katara goes well beyond her resentment of his previous choices and any interpersonal problems they have between themselves. So he takes the initiative. He goes and pays a visit on Sokka, who was not expecting a visit from Zuko, that's for sure. And during their conversation, he's asking what happened to their mother, how did she die, what happened, what were the circumstances. And Zuko's putting the puzzle pieces together, which makes him unique amongst the characters. No one else is spending that time analyzing what's going on with Katara and her emotional state. For everyone else, she's the removed, motherly, authoritative parental figure. You don't see, she's taking care of their needs. They're not thinking about hers. So this is quite a change of pace for Zuko to be the one person to say, no, it's important for Katara to deal with this. Her feelings matter. It matters to me. This needs to be dealt with. And he knows she needs to have this confrontation. She needs closure, and she needs to be able to deal with her grief. And in a lot of ways, he understands that in a way the rest of the gang can't. He remembers what it was like to feel driven in his mission. He has to do this thing in order to restore his honor, and how that can just eat a person alive. He's the only person in that group who really gets that. So Zuko sits outside of her tent all night until she comes out in the morning. And he tells her that he knows who killed her mother and how and where to find him, so that she can then decide what to do about it. So they decide to go on a little excursion and confront the killer. Aang and Sokka make objections. Zuko stands up for Katara and for her right to seek out justice and make whatever decision she saw fit. He did not tell Katara what to do or how to do it. He just took action to support her and be willing to be there no matter what the outcome of that was. There was no judgment, no nagging, no, you need to adopt my standards and kind of ignore yours the way Aang did. He just looked after her. He took care of her and was prepared to face whatever emotional fallout was the result of this quest. Zuko stayed by Katara's side during the most difficult moment of her life, without making it about him, without making demands of any kind. No other character did the same for her. And from that point forward, Zuko and Katara's relationship was in a good and balanced place. They were co-parenting the gang, they were sharing the responsibilities, they were working together as a cohesive team. There was no further drama, no major disagreements, just a natural ebb and flow, yin and yang. We also see that Zuko rather formed the habit of being at Katara's side, and we see this during the Ember Island play. Now, despite that they moved slightly away from each other when the play gave the impression that they had confessed undying love to each other in the Crystal Cave, he still came back and sat next to Katara throughout the remainder of the play. The fact that they were both uncomfortable about being called out in this alarmingly public way is perfectly natural, and it's to be expected when suddenly you're being confronted, as if it's common knowledge, with feelings that you're only beginning to realize that you have. You haven't really quite admitted this to yourself, let alone admitted it to each other, let alone had a discussion about how to proceed from that point forward. Another thing, and this is truly a moment for the history book, Zuko accomplished something that no other character ever had. He changed Katara's mind about what she was going to do. When Aang stormed off in a fit of angst over what to do about the Fire Lord, Katara's instinct was to go after him and continue the discussion. However, with a light touch on her shoulder, Zuko stops her. He says Aang needs some alone time, and Katara trusts his judgment and yields and does what he thought was right. The significance of this degree of trust and respect cannot be overstated. It's an admission that Zuko has a better understanding of what's going on with Aang, their de facto son, than she does. No other character would have been able to get away with that, let alone. And this also represents a tacit agreement that his approach for dealing with Aang was the better approach. This simply is not what happens when Katara is given advice, particularly regarding Aang, at any point during the show. She has never trusted someone else's judgment over her own. It is a huge leap of faith, and it says a great deal about wherein she and Zuko stood with each other. Now, before we come to the end, let's examine how at each season, at the very last episode, there's a climactic moment between Zuko and Katara. At the end of season 1, we have that fight next to the spirit pool, where Katara defended Aang while Aang was meditating. Another one of Aang had to think about stuff, while Katara had to take action and deal with fallout. We see that Katara and Zuko are evenly matched in this fight, and he even observes that, she's found a master, her skills have improved, she's so much better. And this is also the episode in which we are introduced to Twi and Law, Push and Pull, who are the spirits of the water who were in an eternal dance with each other. They represent balancing opposite energies, and they could not properly exist without each other. It throws all of the universe into chaos and out of balance. This is yin and yang, the balance of the masculine and the feminine. And from a pagan viewpoint, this is a symbol of the god and the goddess. One of the lines during the fight was, "You rise with the moon," referring to Katara, the element of water, which is a stand-in for the goddess and receptive energy. "But I rise with the sun," representing Zuko, the element of fire, and in paganism, the god, and projective energy. Very, very interesting. Because in paganism, particularly Wicca, the god and the goddess, these are not separate entities. They're both their own separate people, but they are always in unison. They are always circling one another, balancing one another, the push and the pull. And it really, in a lot of ways, statements of this kind, and we see several different moments in the show in which there are statements of this kind, that they illustrate in a few simple words the essence of what the show is about and the essence of what pagan spirituality is about. It is all about the balancing of those energies and having a harmonious flow. Now, even while fighting, Katara and Zuko are enacting this seesaw of balance. They are flowing well together, even while still being enemies and fighting. The yin-yang symbol of complementary energies is most instructive, and it's very revealing of their dynamic. They are opposites on one level, but on another, They compose a united whole, and they are incomplete without each other. Zuko and Katara have their commonalities, just as the yin and yang symbol. They both have a piece of the other symbol inside their own being. Zuko and Katara, some of their common ground is they are both very idealistic, they are very passionate, they are deeply committed to their goals, they want to do what's right, they want to make a better world. And they care. My goodness, they care. Now, their opposite characteristics, the water versus fire, this isn't as diametrically opposed as what you might first think. This isn't a situation where there can be no compromise or no middle ground. On the contrary, the water and the fire, as just as the masculine and the feminine, they curb the extreme aspects of those energies. The fire warms the water. The drive prevents emotion from paralyzing someone. Water, in its turn, tempers fire and prevents it from getting out of control, just as empathy prevents ambition from being blind to the well-beings of others. It's just all about keeping that seesaw going, having that harmony. And as the story goes on, we see further evidences that Zuko and Katara have a number of common values, and that their differences are what help each other to grow. There's an old saying that it's the friction in the oyster that makes the pearl, and essentially this is how we see their relationship develop. This is an ideal balance, and with the story and the character arcs and the narrative structure, this is the kind of thing we expect to see in stories about soulmates. So even at that early stage, it is really very obvious what is the natural progression for their relationship and where it makes sense for them to ultimately go. That they are, as long as they are at odds and pulling away from each other, they're going to have these problems, they're going to be out of balance, both of them, but when they come together, that's when things start to change, and that's when they have better outcomes for themselves as individuals and as a team. Now next in Season 2, we have the fight that took place in the Crystal Cave. This is where Zuko and Katara just started to get on the same page, and we're connecting on that deeper level, as we briefly mentioned before. And then Zuko has a moment of regression. He's faced with the temptation to get everything he wanted in the Fire Nation, and then they were on opposite sides of it again. And this was really kind of a necessary point for Zuko. He needed to go the route of getting everything he thought he wanted and realizing that it wasn't what he wanted, it wasn't in alignment with who he was as a person or what values he wanted to uphold, let alone who he wanted to grow into. So, in a way, this betrayal had to happen in order for him to make a full and complete and conscious redemption and evolution. Now, in this fight, both Zuko and Katara are demonstrating a higher skill level than their previous fight. But the difference is that, unlike their previous battle, this is now a more personal dispute. They had a moment of genuine connection, and now, with the betrayal, it's setting that connection aside in preference of something that is essentially valueless. It's giving up something precious for something valueless, and so there's anger with that. But before this fight, before they get to this point, we are watching Zuko and Katara hash a few things out. For example, they discuss how the Fire Nation was the cause for both of them losing their mothers, and once that common ground was established, the perspectives are changing. And by the time we're getting towards the end of their little interlude, Katara is offering to heal Zuko's scar and touches his face. This is really the second time we see direct physical contact between the two of them, and it is an incredibly intimate thing to do. And it's really the only time we see any character touch the scar besides Zuko himself. In fact, earlier in that season, he prevented another girl from touching the scar. And even May, who was his canonical girlfriend in the Fire Nation, never seems to actually touch it. Her hand is always outside of it, below it, around it, never touching the symbol of his pain. Katara does. And not only does Zuko allow this, he actually leans into her touch. This is incredibly intimate. And then they were rudely interrupted and trouble started. However, if they hadn't been interrupted and the healing had actually taken place, I don't think that Zuko would have regressed into his old mistakes or betrayed Katara's newfound trust. Now, for the sake of the narrative, he would still have to be tested at some point, but I just don't think he would have gone that route if she had actually healed him. It's also worth making a note that after Zuko's unfortunate decision that led to his short-lived tenure in the Fire Nation, we are always seeing him pictured next to the water under the moonlight. Now, both the water and the moon are strongly associated with Katara because of their associations with the element of water. And really, from the Crystal Cave onward, in a lot of the scenes, something of Katara that symbolizes her, relates to her, is always around, it's always present. In fact, at the beginning of Season 3, Zuko is traveling home, and he's on a ship on the water, looking up at the moon that is high in the sky. Then we enter May, and he's trying to talk to her about some of his nervousness about going home and what this all means, and she's very dismissive of his concerns because she didn't ask to hear his life story, and she's generally remote and apathetic, for all of her now essentially claiming him as her boyfriend. And this pattern between Zuko and May continues, and it's most destructively seen on a visit to Ember Island, where they have a great big blow-up. And during their fight, Zuko and May are, listing and defining all the reasons why their relationship just does not work. And one of the big things for Zuko that he was particularly frustrated by was her emotional distance. And during this, explosion, we then see him, again, walking next to the sea. The moon is in the sky. Something in Katara is there. There's still a connection. Then when we get to the Season 3 finale, we see Zuko and Katara, instead of fighting each other, they are fighting side by side. And as previously mentioned earlier, ever since they had made amends and, not kissed and made up, but they had certainly hugged and made up, they were practically joined at the hip during those last few episodes, and then they finally go to confront Azula. Now, in the strategy session of the allies, it's decided that Zuko's going to have to face Azula and claim the throne, but, Azula's a prodigy, and as powerful as Zuko and skilled as he's become, Azula is still more powerful. So he's not going to face her alone. Without hesitation, he asks Katara to accompany him and fight at his side, and she accepts with gusto, because they are a team. Come on, get married and make steam babies already. But while they are traveling to challenge Azula, at this point, Aang is MIA, and they're talking about this with worried parents. Is he going to show up? Is he going to face the Fire Lord? Is he going to be able to win? Their baby boy's out in the world alone, and all they can do is hope that he's ready to face it. It's a very interesting, because even at that moment when you might say, oh, well, Katara's worried about Aang because she's actually in love with him, it's like, look at the pattern of behavior. She's talking to her co-parent about their poor child, and they're worried about his chances of surviving the war. Not exactly pining for your sweetie. Now, initially the plan was for Zuko and Katara to attack Azula together, but once Zuko sees that Azula is off her game, because at this point Azula is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and obviously she's not operating at peak performance, and Zuko ends up fighting Azula alone in an Agni Kai, and he does this in hopes that Katara won't get hurt. Now, during the duel, Azula ignores the rules of engagement when she can't beat Zuko and she's frustrated, so she shoots lightning at Katara, who has no way to defend herself, unlike Zuko, who has mastered the technique for redirecting lightning. Zuko literally jumps in front of Katara and takes the hit so it doesn't get her. And the look on his face when he sees what Azula is doing, it's like this is the worst thing in the world that could have ever possibly happened. And the look on Katara's face when she sees what's happening, with the lightning and her being targeted and Zuko taking the hit and protecting her, she is absolutely horrified. If she wasn't consciously aware that she had feelings for Zuko before, she definitely knew it in this moment. And her immediate instinct is to run to Zuko and heal him. But Azula begins to attack her, so Katara has to fight. Now, eventually Katara is able to restrain and capture Azula, and that's the end of the fight. And then Katara is at Zuko's side in a flash, immediately works on healing him, while she's in absolute tears, scared and just worried. Zuko comes to, and he thanks her in a really, really tender way. She replies that she's the one who ought to be thanking him, and it's a beautiful moment of connection and I'll say it, and love. They stand up, and Zuko's looking at the hysterical Azula. She's screaming and bound in chains. Katara's at her side. Her hand and her arm is on his back, giving him what comfort she can. In this moment, there's triumph and sadness and compassion all at once. But what stands out above everything else is the obvious bond between Zuko and Katara. Now, one last point of interest about this pairing. It comes with disguises. Both Zuko and Katara have adopted disguises for different purposes throughout the show. At one point, Zuko was impersonating the blue spirit. So blue equals water tribe equals Katara. And there was an occasion in which Katara impersonated the painted lady spirit. So red equals Fire Nation equals Zuko. And in Fire Nation mythology, the blue spirit and painted lady were not only symbols of hope, but were a married couple. This is another example of Zuko and Katara paralleling legends right down to adopting the colors of each of the other person's culture. So the idea of Zuko and Katara pairing off is really woven into the very fabric of the show, from the mythology, the narrative structure, the theme of finding balance, making peace, forgiveness, redemption, finding family, love in unexpected places, union. And this is also seen in their character arcs. It's just in the DNA of everything. So it's a bit much to believe that all of this was just ship baiting, accidental, or deliberate misdirection. It just doesn't pass the smell test for me. There's too much there. Now, the creators say that they wanted to create a will they or won't they romance for Katara, and I would argue that they did, but not with Aang as they say they intended to. Because if we base our ideas on everything that we've looked and seen of the story up to the last few minutes of the show, it's just obvious that Aang is not really in the running for Katara's heart. He's on the track for learning that the first person you fall in love with is not necessarily the person you marry and find and spend the rest of your life with. Whereas it is with Zuko that Katara has a will they or won't they journey, as well as embodying the perennial favorite trope of enemies to lovers. It just works on every level. So to wrap this up, and thank you for bearing with me up to this point, fictional writing has to bear a terrible burden. And that burden is that it has to make more sense than real life and still be able to convey human truth in fantastical settings. If the outcome of a story doesn't resonate with people and it's emotionally dishonest and it just doesn't make sense, then it creates the kind of controversy that's been seen since the end of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Now, while this has generated a great deal of conversation, that conversation is in consequence to the audience's frustration. At least half of the audience, which is about the ratio of Katang versus Sutara supporters. And it's not an expression of how satisfying a conclusion the story had. So let's talk about the last 5 minutes of the show. They were truly baffling. Out of nowhere, May shows up at Zuko's coronation. The last time we saw May, she was arrested by Azula, thrown into a Fire Nation prison because she helped Zuko escape. Zuko was not just surprised to see her, but he didn't know she was out of the Fire Nation jail. Not only do we know from this that he did not order her release, he hadn't even checked up on her to find out what happened. This is not the conduct of a young man in love. Period. Then we see May kissing on Zuko like nothing really happened and told him to never break up with her again. And you're just left with kind of this what the hell reaction. Everything about May represented the old status quo of the Fire Nation in mind and in deed. Her chief character trait was apathy. She had a habit of dismissing Zuko and being disinterested when he was trying to be emotionally connected with her. There's no reason why they would have reconciled and gotten back together. When Zuko left the Fire Nation to join the gang, he left May a note. When he escaped the prison of the Fire Nation, he actually locked her in a cell to keep her out of the way. And he never mentioned May again, and he hadn't mentioned her before. So, Why? Why should we as the audience believe that when he's obviously willing to walk away from her and obviously is not all that concerned with what happened to her, why would we believe that he would be happy and in love and getting back with her at the end? But as much as that's weird, it is nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to with what happened next. We're at the final scene. We're at Ba Sing Se. We're at Uncle Iroh's beloved tea shop, and the whole gang is there. Aang is standing on the balcony. Katara goes to him. They hug. Then Katara initiates a kiss with Aang, and then cue the sunset swelling of the music, and here's your happily ever after. It just doesn't wash. Over the course of the final season, we see Katara not only in mother mode, but in hyper mother mode, and she is actively setting boundaries with Aang over and over and over again. The romantic moments stand out because they are so out of character, and they contradict the rest of the narrative. And to keep in mind, the last one-on-one conversation Katara and Aang had was during the Ember Island play, when Katara firmly rejected his advances. The last public conversation Katara and Aang had was when Aang was yelling at her for not magically producing a non-lethal way to deal with Ozai, as if it was somehow her job to figure all that out. When Katara went to go after Aang to continue the conversation, remember, Zuko stopped her and advised that Aang needed time to think for himself, and she respected Zuko's judgment. Katara and Aang have had multiple serious disagreements over the course of the third season, none of which were resolved, and their friendship simply was not as close as what it was before. And Katara is even more that motherly but remote mother figure. Then the further she grew away from Aang, the closer she grew to Zuko. It was a direct parallel. Far away from Aang, cozy to Zuko. So we have to ask ourselves, when Aang was rejected and then left in a disagreement and Katara didn't go after him, as would have happened at any other time, we have to ask ourselves what changed between those events and the kiss on the balcony. Because we have not seen Aang and Katara interact. We have not seen them resolve any of their differences. There has been literally nothing. And that's what makes the end of the story so jarring, even after multiple viewings of the show. You just can't quite make yourself believe that that is actually happening. So, if it had been up to me, here's how I would have handled this. I would have done the following. Now, when it comes to Aang, if we were going to select a long-term partner out of characters we saw appear in the show, there are really two possibilities. Meng, who we met at the Fortune Teller Village, or Toph, who was Aang's earthbending teacher. Now, when she liked Aang just because he was Aang. She wasn't really aware that he was the Avatar, so that wasn't a factor. It's not about his title or who he is or being some kind of inspiration. She just liked him. And I think Aang really needs to be seen by his life partner as the person he is, not the title he bears, the job he does, or a mission he needs to fulfill. And he was the last Airbender, and that bestows upon him the obligation to marry and have children in hopes of producing more Airbenders. But his duties as the Avatar would naturally take him all over the world, and that wouldn't stop. So he would need someone with a strong character to be at home to look after any children that they had. It makes more sense for the matriarch of Aang's new family to be someone who hadn't really been an active participant in world events, hadn't wanted to be a fighter and be involved. Meng wasn't involved in the war. She just didn't have those kind of ambitions. So she would have been ideally suited to deal with Aang having to have this public spotlight while still holding the fort within the family at home. And this scenario would have fulfilled the fortune teller's prediction about Aang marrying someone with big ears, which Aang has, and the prediction that Katara would marry a powerful bender, because Zuko is indeed a powerful bender. Now, in the case of the possibility with Toph, Toph was Aang's natural opposite and his equal. She didn't put up with his nonsense, and she didn't coddle him. Aang had to learn how to stand up to her, and Toph, in turn, had to learn to accept a certain degree of flexibility when dealing with Aang. In the episode with the swamp, Aang actually had a vision of Toph before he met her, and we see Toph presented in a very feminine and a very playful way. And even though that isn't her general mode of being, that is a part of herself that, while buried, is still there, and she can draw upon it at any time she chooses. Now, this is easily construed as being a vision of a possible future romantic partner, not just someone who happened to teach him earthbending. Toph was very adventurous by nature, and while it's unlikely that she would have been the sort to stay home and raise the kids while Aang was off traveling the world being the Avatar, what is possible to envision is that she'd insist on the whole family traveling together, saying, "There's plenty of room on Appa, off we go." And another thing is that Toph is really the only character who we see Aang bicker with, and you know what I'm talking about, because bickering is one of those recognizable patterns of potential romantic partners in fiction. At first they don't get along, then they learn to understand each other, and then they get together, have a lot of fun figuring out how to stay together, and it's just a fun, wild ride. Now, regarding the fortune teller's prophecy, our dear sweet Mang might still have found her guy with big ears elsewhere. Katara could still marry Zuko, the powerful bender, and Aang would have forged his own fate by bringing romance into his life through his own efforts, and certainly building a relationship with Toph would require work. The interesting thing about Toph is that she was the group's truth teller. She would say what everyone else was thinking, and she could see clearly at times when other people were wrapped up in emotion. Toph was ideally situated to tell Aang, after he was rejected by Katara at the Ember Island play, that he wasn't alone in having a crush on someone who didn't feel the same, and she understood what it was like to care about someone but still feel hurt by them. Of course, this would be a reference to Toph's big and very obvious crush on Sokka, and to a lesser extent her crush on Zuko. If anyone could have pulled Aang out of the depression of losing a first love, it would be Toph, because she would be the first to tell him that life still goes on even if your crush doesn't fall in love with you. There's still life to live, there's still fun, and you're still going to find someone who is going to love you exactly the way you are. The fact that this didn't occur was really a missed opportunity in the narrative. Now, in Katara's case, quite obviously, I'd have chosen to pair her off with Zuko. This would have paid off all the subtle clues, the themes, the structure, the meaning of the story, as well as their character arcs. Would have been a huge payoff for all of this build-up. And what's more, you wouldn't have even needed to have a big romantic kiss between the two of them at the end of the series to make their outcome clear. You could have just made very slight, very subtle changes to the last 5 minutes of the show, and it would have gotten the job done. For example, you could still have Aang and Zuko having that buddy moment and will always be friends right before Zuko's coronation. Then, instead of seeing May make an appearance and claiming Zuko, Zuko could have asked a member of his staff if his order to release May and Ty Lee from the prison had been carried out, and that could be answered in the affirmative, saying that they were in the crowd to watch the coronation. That would have said, oh, Zuko's a good guy. He made sure that the girls that got thrown in prison for helping him out have been released and everything's fine. Then you could still have all the gang going to Uncle Iroh's tea shop, but with a slight change. Instead of May hanging around Zuko, we see Zuko with Katara. We could see them reach out for each other's hands, hold them, look into each other's eyes, and smile. It would have been a sweet gesture communicating that they were at the beginning of something wonderful and romantic and promising, but it wouldn't be too much too soon, and we would still see a glimpse of that future growth, future happiness together. You could even have gone so far as to see Zuko put his arm around Katara, and they could look into each other's eyes and smile and see them, accept affection between each other, and that would have said it all. You would still have that unspoken implication that one day they're going to get married when they're older, they're going to rule the Fire Nation together, they'll work together to heal the wounds of the war, they'll reconcile their countries, raise a family together, grow old together. It would have been perfectly obvious that that was their ultimate destiny. Then we could see Aang still standing on that balcony, still looking at that sunset, but instead of Katara joining him, he could have a vision of Avatar Roku, one of Aang's previous lives, and Avatar Roku would have said, "You have done well, young Avatar." Aang would have gotten that stamp of approval, a sense of mission accomplished, and now he can move forward into the next challenge in the next phase of his life. And the music can triumphantly swell. Aang fulfilled his destiny. He completed his arc. He's accepted his responsibilities, and He's taking satisfaction in his true calling as the Avatar. Beautiful, meaningful, honest. Fade out, end of series. And then, of course, in the next series, you could see, instead of the Legend of Korra, with the train wreck and mess that was, you could instead see Aang beginning his journey towards becoming a man, growing up, and the rest of the gang moving further into their maturity, and beginning to see some of those pairings beginning to turn into marriages and families. Would have worked a lot better. I challenge the writers for the upcoming live-action series to do better. You have an opportunity. Please, please, please. Listen to some of the feedback that's been going on for, the past 13 years at this point. You have an opportunity to write an ending that makes better sense and that pays off character arcs. No pressure, just saying. So, I think that's about it. Thank you for bearing with me to the end. Let me know your thoughts on the subject. I'd enjoy hearing some feedback on my perspective. If it wasn't for the debates that I've had with Katang supporters over the past couple of years, I probably would not have analyzed Avatar: The Last Airbender in such detail. And I, as a consequence, wouldn't have discovered just the goldmine of ideas and symbolism and themes that's all there in the story just waiting to be devoured. So to both the Katangers and to the Zootarans, I owe you a great intellectual debt. And thank you for all the discussions that have ultimately led to making this video. So again, that's it for me. Leave your comments below, and of course, feel free to join the conversation at Blackbird's Brew. Link in the description box below. I shall see you in another video.